What you're about to hear isn't just a story about loss, it's about a truth buried beneath the snow-covered hills of Montana, a secret that waited years for the right winter to reveal itself. Stay until the end, because every silence hides something you were never meant to hear. Never go to the farm, Catherine. Promise me. Those were Jonathan Hale's final words before his breath turned to air in that sterile hospital room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and fading flowers. I nodded because when the person you've loved for 32 years asks for a promise, you keep it even when you don't understand it. But promises have their own gravity. They pull you back to the places you swore you'd never return. For 3 months after his funeral, I lived inside the slow echo of his absence. Every morning I brewed coffee for 2 out of habit and poured the second cup down the sink. The house in Missoula felt too clean, too arranged, like a hotel room left behind by its guests. Julia came by on weekends pretending not to check on me. She'd leave groceries on the counter and talk about her new job in Seattle, about city lights and freedom words that belonged to her generation, not mine. I smiled and told her to live her life even as the silence grew heavy around me. Then came the letter. It arrived on a gray Monday, sealed in cream paper embossed with a law firm crest, Edward Winters and Associates. Inside, a single sentence written in Edward's meticulous handwriting. Jonathan Hale instructed me to deliver this key and message to you 3 months after his passing. The envelope contained a small brass key, old and cold to the touch, tied with a piece of red string. Under it, a note in Jonathan's unmistakable scrawl. For when you're ready to know why I made you promise. That night I sat by the window and watched snow fall over the streetlights. Grief had been quiet until then, like a polite guest. Now it felt restless, pacing the room. By dawn I had packed a single suitcase and printed a map to Silver Ridge Farm, the property Jonathan had owned long before I met him, the one he never spoke about. The road to Silver County wound through valleys dusted with snow pines bending under white weight. I drove alone, the heater humming, the world turning pale outside the windshield. Somewhere near the old railway crossing, I passed a weathered sign, Silver Ridge Farm Private Property. The letters were fading, but the warning was clear. I stopped the car and sat for a long moment, my fingers tight on the steering wheel. Jonathan's voice whispered through memory, "Promise me." Then softly I turned the key and drove through the gate. The farmhouse stood on a low rise, its windows blind with frost. Snow creaked beneath my boots as I walked to the porch. The brass key slid perfectly into the lock. Inside, the air smelled of dust pine and something older, like unopened time. There were paintings stacked against the walls, brushes in jars, a layer of silence that felt deliberate. Jonathan had been here recently. The fireplace still held half-burned logs, and a mug rested beside an open ledger. On the dining table lay a wooden box with my name engraved on a small metal plate. I opened it and found a laptop, a folded letter, and a thumb drive labeled Day 1. The letter read, "Catherine, if you're reading this, it means you kept your promise long enough to break it for the right reason. Everything you need to understand me and what comes next is here. Watch the videos in order, 1 each day. Don't trust anyone until the 7th. The handwriting trembled at the edges as if written through pain. I felt my throat tighten. I connected the drive, press play, and there he was. Jonathan, thinner, paler, but smiling that quiet smile that had always steadied me. "Hello, my love. If you're seeing this, I'm already gone. Don't be afraid. There are things I never told you, not because I didn't trust you, but because I wanted to protect you from the men who carry my name." The screen flickered. A draft rattled the windows. Jonathan looked straight into the camera. "You'll meet them soon, Robert, Allen, and David. They believe Silver Ridge hides oil, and they're right. But what they don't know is who truly owns this land now. That's you. Everything I built here was meant to give you a choice, not a burden." I paused the video, heart hammering. Brothers-in-law I'd met only once years ago at a Christmas dinner filled with polite distance. They'd seemed harmless then, gray suits, careful smiles. Now Jonathan's words turned their civility into warning. A knock startled me. Through the frosted glass, a tall figure waited, a man in a heavy coat holding a lantern against the wind. I opened the door a cautious inch. "Mrs. Hale." His voice was low, steady. "Ellis Grant. I manage the ranch for Mr. Hale." His face was weather-carved, eyes pale as the sky before a storm. He stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "Your husband told me you might one day and that I should give you this." From his coat pocket, he produced a folded map, edges yellowed with use. On it, Jonathan's handwriting again, arrows notes a circle drawn around a section labeled West Ridge Reserve. Ellis tapped the paper. He said you'd need to see what's under this hill before anyone else does. Outside wind moaned through the pines. Inside the fire Jonathan had left waiting in the hearth finally caught spreading slow amber light across the room. For the first time since his death, I felt him near not as a memory, but as purpose. Somewhere beneath the snow of Silver Ridge, the truth he'd hidden was waiting, and the promise I had made was about to become the line between love and betrayal. What you're about to hear isn't merely a story about grief. It's a story about the moment grief looks you in the eye and whispers that what you trusted may have never been true. Stay with me until the end, because in Silver County even silence leaves footprints. I stood in the great room of Silver Ridge Farm with the fire Jonathan left ready to light finally taking hold, the kindling crackling like thin bones under weight. Ellis had just gone, his lantern, glow swallowed by the porch dark, and the house settled into that particular quiet you only hear in winter, a hush so complete it makes you wonder what it's hiding. Jonathan's video. His voice steady, his eyes too clear for a dying man, still hovered in the air as if I could reach out and press my palm against it and feel heat. You'll meet them soon, he'd said of his brothers. They believe this land will make them rich. They're right about the ground. They're wrong about who owns the truth. That line tore something open in me. For months, I had obeyed absence like a commandment. His favorite mug turned facing the window, his coat still on the back of the dining chair, the second pillow left untouched. Then in that room with the storm nosing the eaves, my grief stepped aside to let suspicion through. Not at him, never at him, but at the shape of our marriage seen from this new angle, the hidden corridor behind the familiar room. Love, I've learned, has corners even memory forgets to dust. I wish I could tell you the first fracture appeared at the lawyer's office when Edward Winters slid that brass key toward me across his polished desk. But it began earlier at the funeral where lilies and long faces and casseroles are supposed to soothe the living into soft compliance. The service had ended, the organist had closed the lid on Amazing Grace, and people were doing what people do, pouring murmurs like cream into coffee, saying, "He's in a better place," with the practiced certainty of those who don't know anything at all. I was collecting sympathy cards from the table when I noticed it, a wreath unlike the others, smaller, woven with dark fur and tiny white heather with a satin ribbon pinned at the base. No card, no sender's name. I touched the ribbon and felt something stiff under the fold. The funeral coordinator called my name and I let the ribbon fall, thinking I'd check later. Later came in the reception room when the platters were already missing their corners and ants pressed my fingers too hard. In the ladies' lounge, I slid the ribbon free. A small envelope was stitched into the greenery as if it had been smuggled across a border. Catherine, it read, not Mrs. Hale, not Katie, not the pet name he used to whisper against my hair. Just Catherine in a hand that punched the ink into the paper with deliberate pressure. I'm not proud of what I did next. I hid the envelope in my coat pocket and said thank you to Mrs. Grant for her broccoli salad like I hadn't just found a splinter in the skin of my day. I didn't open it until night when the house had surrendered to darkness and I'd tucked a blanket around myself like a barricade. The seal broke with a sigh. Inside one line. Forgive me for what you will learn after I'm gone. J. The date below it stopped me cold. It was 2 days after Jonathan died. You can say what you like about postmarks and misprints and how grief makes numbers swim. I have taught English long enough to know the difference between a smudge and a statement. The J was the stroke of the F curled back on itself, the way his signature always did that flourish he practiced in the margins during long calls. And the date was not a typo. I turned the paper over searching for a trick. Only blankness met me, the kind that doesn't explain itself. I put the note back in its envelope and tucked it into the blue jewelry box he'd given me on our 10th anniversary under the pearl earrings he saved 3 months to buy. 2 weeks later, somewhere between dropping thank you notes at the post office and forgetting why I'd walked into the laundry room, Edward called. "Catherine," he said in that measured way he used for bad news and interest rate changes, "there's one more item." By then, I thought I had heard everyone more grief could invent. I went to his office because habit is an animal you feed without looking. You've probably been in a room like his walnut-paneled diplomas lodged like antlers on the wall windows that prefer snow to sunshine. He poured tea the way only men of a certain era do, as if it were a legal transaction. Then he pushed a small wooden box toward me as if it might explode. Brushed metal plate, my name engraved, the corners worn like they'd been handled too much. Inside, the brass key that now rests in my coat pocket, cold as a dare. A maple leaf keychain, even though we live 1,000 miles from any Vermont postcard. And a second envelope in Jonathan's precise pen, the one that liked straight lines and didn't trust the mess between them, for when you're ready to know why he'd written. Shock is not always thunder. Sometimes it is the gentle, humiliating realization that the person who promised you no more secrets had kept one aside, not out of malice, but out of a conviction that you weren't strong enough to carry it alive. I was 52, widowed, competent enough to balance our accounts and cook a roast that made our daughter sigh with the pleasure of being home. And yet he had chosen to place this truth outside the reach of my living hand. It felt like standing at the edge of our marriage, looking down at the pieces of what I thought was whole. Betrayal is a hard word. I will not throw it at a dead man, but something like it, its little cousin, the one with softer teeth, took a bite and left a purple crescent on my trust. That night I opened Jonathan's letter because the kindest thing we can do for our dead is stop pretending they can't hurt us. You already know some of what it said because you've listened to the first part of this. He released me from the promise. He wrote about Silver Ridge Farm, about a desk and a password, and a rose left like a placeholder for a future I hadn't imagined. But there was a line I didn't mention before because saying it aloud made it heavier. When you find the other letter, believe it. It was sent after me, but it comes from the same place. I held both pages, then the funeral wreath note and this confession, and let them press their weight into my hands until my palms tingled. I didn't sleep. Grief taught me that nothing can be done to the middle of the night but survive it. By morning, I had made the small, stubborn decision that changes a life. I would not wait for courage to arrive with perfect posture. I would go without it and let courage catch up. I packed a bag, left a message for Julia, careful, loving, infuriatingly vague, and drove north along roads I had driven once on a vacation when Julia was a girl, and Jonathan wanted us to see elk. The same mountains now looked like they had something to say back. People tell you not to drive alone with the past buckled into the front seat. Those same people leave you alone with casseroles and platitudes, so I trust them only to the point where I can still breathe. I talked to Jonathan because silence is immoral when the dead are that close. Why now, I asked the windshield. Why send me there of all places? The only answer was the hypnotic thunk of tires over seams and the way snow frays the edges of a field into a watercolor someone forgot to finish. You know, the rest of that day, the gate, the key, the cold surrender of the lock, the way rooms remembered us even when I did not remember them. Ellis's knock, the map, the circle around West Ridge Reserve like a bruise. The laptop on the table, the screen bright enough to make me squint, his face lifting out of time to meet mine. You know, the feeling of a house that recognizes you, not as a guest, but as a test. What you don't know, because I've kept it back until now, is what else I found in that wooden box with the key. Under the velvet lining, tacked there with 2 almost invisible stitches, was a second key, thin and old, stamped with a number I didn't understand. 17. I nearly dismissed it as a manufacturer's mark until I turned the velvet back fully and saw the sliver of paper tucked beneath. After the 7th video, it said, Open Locker 17. No location, no bank name, no hint beyond the certainty that he expected me to find it. The old resentment, the one that says love owes you full disclosure while love is still breathing, flared and faded in the same breath. He was steering from beyond the shoreline, yes, but in fairness I had asked for a map. I should have called Julia then. I should have brought my daughter into the circle of what we were inheriting so she wouldn't later accuse me of conspiracy with a ghost. But if you're a mother, you know this. We hoard the hardest things in our throats until we can figure out how to feed them to our children without choking them. Also, if you've been listening carefully, you know I was ashamed. Not of him. Of my eagerness to obey someone who had left of my pliability in the hands of a man who no longer existed except in pixels and paper. The shock of that realization was its own betrayal, a small private treason against the self I thought I'd become. As dusk pulled its gray scarf across the hills, I set the second key back under the velvet and closed the box gently, like tucking a child in. The fire had settled into that low orange mutter you can feel in your ribs. Outside, somewhere beyond the black porch, a horse snorted, then quieted. I imagined the brothers' SUV on a road I couldn't see, headlights combing the snow, the confident entitlement of men who believe what is yours must be theirs if they name it correctly. In the morning, I would watch day 2. I would call Edward. I would decide about Julia. But now, in this first hour of being fully awake to what my marriage still expected of me, I walked to the window, set my hand flat against the cold glass, and let the shock steady into something I could use. There's one more thing I want to ask before we move forward, and I want you to answer honestly because stories aren't just told, they're chosen. If you were in my place standing in that room with the second key hidden under velvet and the note dated after death in your pocket, would you walk away or would you open the box again? Press 0 to walk away, 1 to open it. The morning came gray and slow, the kind of Montana light that forgets how to be bright. I made coffee on the old gas stove Jonathan had refused to replace, listening to the burner click 3 times before the flame caught. For a moment I stood still, mug in hand, watching the steam rise like a small ghost rehearsing its exit. The house was quiet except for the creak of the beams settling above me and the soft hiss of snow sliding off the roof. It was hard to believe that the same walls once held laughter. Ellis had said he would return after feeding the horses. I used those minutes to do what I hadn't dared the night before. I took the wooden box from the table, laid it open, and lifted the velvet lining again. The second key gleamed faintly in the morning light, small numbered, a question made of brass. I traced the engraved 17 with my thumb, wondering what Jonathan meant by it. Then I noticed something I hadn't before, a faint outline, a smudge just beneath where the key had rested. It was shaped like an arrow pointing downward. The arrow led me to the floorboard under the table, slightly raised. When I pried it loose with a butter knife, dust floated up in a sigh. Beneath lay a narrow gap no bigger than a shoebox lined with waxed cloth. Inside was a small black recorder, the kind reporters used before everything went digital. I pressed play. For a few seconds there was only static, then Jonathan's voice thinner and raspier than in the videos. "If you're hearing this, cat, you've already broken the first promise." "Good. Promises die faster than people. What matters is what you do next." The tape hissed again, but another sound followed, someone else breathing on the line. Then a male voice I didn't recognize, distant, muffled. "We're not alone out here." The tape clicked off. I sat there with the recorder in my hand, the cold crawling up through the floor. Outside, Ellis's truck door slammed. I hid the recorder under my sweater and replaced the board before he came in. He brushed snow from his shoulders, the brim of his hat glistening. "Storm's coming down from the ridge," he said. "You might want to check the generator before nightfall." I nodded, but my voice didn't trust me enough to speak. The words "we're not alone" kept threading through the quiet like a warning stitched into fabric. When he left again, I turned on the laptop and opened day 2. Jonathan appeared wearing a flannel shirt. I recognized the one with the tear at the shoulder seam I'd promised to mend. His smile tried to steady me, but his eyes betrayed urgency. "If you found the map," he said, "you'll see the circle at West Ridge Reserve. That's where the first well was drilled unofficially. My brothers called it a test site. I called it a mistake we couldn't afford to bury. Go there, but not alone." He looked away from the camera as if checking something off screen. Then he whispered, "Someone else has copies of these files. If I disappear, they'll come for you next." The screen froze on his face, mid-blink, the file ending abruptly. I shut the laptop, heart rattling like coins in a jar. For a long minute, I just listened to the wind, to the ticking of the old clock, to the pulse in my ears. Then I fetched my coat. West Ridge Reserve lay half a mile from the main house across a field laced with wire fencing. Snow came sideways, now blurring distance, muting everything. Each step was an argument with the drifts. When I reached the ridge, the wind ripped my breath away. A cluster of metal pipes jutted from the ground, capped with rust half buried in ice. Near them stood an old maintenance shed with a padlock. I used the brass key. It turned like a memory that hadn't been used in years. Inside, the air smelled of oil and mold. Shelves held tools, notebooks swollen with damp, and a folder marked 1998 survey. Beneath the folder, a leather pouch. I opened it and found photographs, black and white images of men beside a drilling rig, one of them unmistakably Jonathan Younger, his hair wind-tossed and proud. Behind him loomed Robert Hale, his eldest brother, looking into the camera with that mix of charm and contempt he'd always worn like a tailored coat. Tucked between the photos was a final picture, the same group, same rig, but this time in the background a woman, not me. She was standing too close to Jonathan, her smile angled toward him. Written on the back for Jay in case we forget the cost. No signature. The air felt suddenly thinner. I sat down on the workbench, the boards groaning under me. Betrayal stories always begin with something ordinary. A letter, a smile, a forgotten name, and only later do you realize the ordinary was the disguise. I had thought mine ended with Jonathan's secrets. But maybe I was still inside one. I must have sat there half an hour before headlights swept the walls. Ellis stepped in his cheeks raw from the cold. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said. His eyes moved to the photos spread before me. "You found them." "Who is she?" I asked. He hesitated, removed his gloves. Her name was Meredith Clark. She worked with the survey team. She left right after the first well collapsed. Collapsed. Gas leak, explosion, whatever word you prefer. Officially, it was weather damage. Unofficially, he stopped. Your husband blamed himself. I picked up the photograph again. Meredith's hand rested lightly on Jonathan's arm. The gesture was intimate, but not tender, more like partnership forged under pressure. Still, the question it lit inside me was primitive. Had he loved her? Ellis must have read my face. "Cat," he said softly, "this land holds more ghosts than graves. Don't start counting yet." He loaded the box of documents into his truck and promised to take them to Edward Winters for safekeeping. I followed him back to the house, the snow erasing our tracks as quickly as we made them. That night, the power went out. The generator groaned twice. Then silence fell so thick it felt solid. I lit candles, their flames trembling like nervous witnesses. On the table, the recorder sat where I'd left it. I turned it over in my hands. A small panel on the side I hadn't noticed before slid open to reveal a microcassette labeled Copy B. I pressed play. Static again. Then Jonathan's voice, lower, urgent. "If you find the second recording, don't trust the company. They've buried more than oil," Meredith tried to warn me. A pause. Then the same foreign voice as before, sharper now. "She's already gone, Jonathan. So are you." The tape ended. The candle nearest me guttered out smoke curling like handwriting into the air. For a moment I was sure I heard footsteps on the porch. When I opened the door, only wind entered full of snow and accusation. I locked up every window, drew the curtains, and sat beside the dying fire until exhaustion took pity. I dreamed of water black and viscous rising from the ground and turning to mirrors that reflected not my face, but Jonathan's multiplied and fading. At dawn, Ellis returned with Edward on the phone. "You'd better hear this," Edward said. "The brothers know you're back. They filed a claim this morning, say Jonathan signed over the reserve before his death." I laughed without humor. Then they forged it. He was in the hospital. "I know," Edward said. "That's why they'll push harder." "Do you still have the key marked 17? "Yes." "Good. That might be the only proof left that the property's yours. Keep it close." When the call ended, I realized my hands were shaking the phone slick with sweat. The world was rearranging itself again, moving pieces while I tried to name them. Every discovery opened another door. By afternoon, the storm cleared. The hills glistened under a pale sun, beautiful and brutal. I walked out to the fence line and looked toward the ridge where the shed stood. Smoke or maybe fog hung low above it. Somewhere beneath that ridge was the truth my husband had tried to lock away, the truth Meredith Clark might have died for. As I turned back, a truck appeared on the road, black unfamiliar. It stopped near the gate. Two figures stepped out, one tall, one short. Even at that distance, I knew the taller one's stance, Robert Hale. He raised a hand not to wave, but to signal, "We see you." I closed the gate and latched it, the metal biting my palm. For the first time, fear and curiosity felt like the same emotion, sharp, necessary, alive. I want to tell you more about what I found next, but that belongs to the following day. Before we go on, tell me something simple. When you listen to betrayal stories like this one, do you believe the truth heals, or does it just open new wounds? Type 0 for heals, 1 for wounds. And if this part moved, you leave a like. It helps the story find those who still believe that even betrayal can lead us home. When the black truck disappeared beyond the bend of the hill, I went back inside and shut every door I could find. It wasn't just the cold I wanted to keep out. It was the way Robert's stare had stripped the world of sound. I tried to busy myself with small things, washing the mugs, folding a throw blanket, pretending to read the same page of an old novel, until the words blurred into nothing. But the truth sat beside me like a guest who wouldn't leave. By evening, I decided to call Julia. The phone rang long enough for me to imagine her not answering, but then her voice came bright and brisk. "Mom." "Hey, I was just thinking of calling you." I smiled at that, stupidly relieved. "You were?" "Yeah," she said, though maybe not for the reason you think. Something in her tone made me sit straighter. "What's wrong?" "Well," a pause like a paper tearing. "Uncle Alan emailed me last night. He said you've been keeping things from me. About Dad, about someone named Meredith Clark." The name hit like cold water. "Julia, listen to me. He sent a photo," she continued, her voice rising. "Dad and this woman. You didn't tell me he had someone else." My throat closed before words could find their shape. Julia, that picture isn't what you think. Then tell me what it is. I could hear traffic in the background, Seattle rain tapping on her windshield. Please, I said, don't believe them. They're trying to divide us. Then stop giving them reasons. The call ended with a hollow click that sounded louder than any argument could have. For a long time, I sat there holding the silent phone, feeling something fragile inside me tilt. You'd think betrayal stories would make you cynical, but the cruelest ones are those you didn't see coming from your own blood. The storm that had haunted the ridge for days finally broke that night. Wind pressed against the windows, like someone insisting to be let in. I lit the last of the candles and sat at Jonathan's old desk, trying to steady my breathing. Somewhere beyond the farm, thunder rolled, dragging its slow anger across the valley. I took out the photograph of Meredith Clark again. The woman's smile looked more complicated in candlelight. I studied Jonathan's eyes, tired, kind, caught between pride and guilt. Did he look at her the way he used to look at me? I hated the question even as it formed. Maybe grief makes you rewrite history until it fits the shape of your wounds. I didn't sleep. Around 3 a.m, headlights flared through the window. I went to the door, half convinced Robert had returned. But it wasn't him. It was Julia. She stepped out of the car with that same posture her father used to have when walking into bad news, defiant, beautiful, afraid of her own fear. I drove all night, she said. We need to talk. Inside, she didn't bother to remove her coat. She stood near the hearth, arms folded. Show me the truth, Mom. I nodded because what else could I do? I led her to the table where I'd spread the documents from the shed. Photos, maps, Jonathan's notes. The recorder, the second key. The envelope from the funeral wreath. She scanned them all quickly like she was trying to catch me in a lie. You kept all this from me. I was trying to protect you, I said softly. From what? From Dad's secrets or yours? The accusation landed harder than she knew. You think I wanted this? You think I enjoyed digging through ashes? You don't understand how it feels to find out your father wasn't who you thought, she said. To realize everything you built your childhood on was... Julia? My voice cracked. Everything you know about your father came from love, not lies. The Hales want to own the land and they'll twist anything to get it. She shook her head. And you're the only one who knows the truth. That's convenient. She walked away before I could stop her climbing the narrow stairs to the attic. I followed, but by the time I reached the top, she had already found the locked trunk near the window. What's in here? She demanded. Old things, I said. Open it. I hesitated, then used the same brass key that had opened every door so far. Inside were letters Jonathan's, some to me, some never sent. One envelope at the bottom was addressed to Meredith Clark. Julia's breath caught. Oh my God! I lifted it carefully. The paper smelled faintly of tobacco and cedar. The handwriting was unmistakably his. I turned it over and saw it had never been mailed. I opened it before she could. Meredith, I wish I could undo what happened that night at the Ridge. We both know what we lost, and I can't bear for Catherine to carry this weight. I'll tell her when the time is right. Until then, keep the files safe. If Robert finds out, none of us are safe. No signature, no date. Julia stared at me, her eyes glassy. He loved her. I folded the letter and set it down. He felt responsible for her, not in love. You have to understand the explosion. But she wasn't listening. I need air, she said, and left. I watched from the window as she walked out into the snow, the wind clawing at her coat. The lamp on the porch swung wildly. For a moment I thought of following her, but something made me stay. Maybe the kind of love that survives children and funerals learns when to let go, even if it hurts. An hour passed. The storm eased. When Julia came back, her cheeks were raw from cold, and her eyes calmer though rimmed red. She sat by the fire without speaking. I talked to Uncle Alan, she said at last. He told me Dad invested money through Meredith. Offshore accounts. He said there's proof. Proof of what? That you're hiding assets. I laughed softly, half disbelief, half despair. Do you really think I'd know how to hide offshore money? She looked down. I don't know what to think anymore. We sat in silence, two women at opposite ends of the same grief. The fire cracked. Outside, the generator coughed back to life. Finally, she spoke. Maybe he was right about one thing. Who? Dad. He used to say we don't get to choose our tests, only how we answer them. She looked at me, then really looked. So, what's your answer, Mom? I reached for her hand. For the first time in months, she didn't pull away. To finish what he started, I said. To find the truth, whatever it costs. She nodded slowly, the first thread of trust weaving back between us. Later that night, when Julia had fallen asleep on the couch, I checked my email. Among the spam and condolences was one new message from an address I didn't recognize, mecredurthprotonmail.com. The subject line read simply, "You don't know what the brothers buried." Inside one sentence, Locker 17 isn't in a bank, it's under the ridge. I stared at it until the words blurred. Then I looked at the photo of Meredith again and saw in the far corner a faint outline of a metal hatch half covered in snow. It could have been coincidence, or it could have been exactly what Jonathan wanted me to find. Julia stirred, murmuring in her sleep. I closed the laptop, turned off the lamp, and sat in the dark with the sound of the wind shifting outside. Somewhere beyond that ridge was the line between truth and madness, and I was walking it barefoot. If you're listening to this with me, if you've ever stood between loyalty and doubt, you already know how thin that line can be. In stories like this, in betrayal stories we inherit and repeat, the hardest part isn't the lie itself. It's deciding which truth is worth keeping. Before we go on, tell me this: when trust breaks between a parent and a child, can it ever be whole again? Type 0 for yes, 1 for never. By dawn, the wind had calmed enough for me to hear my own heartbeat again. The snow outside lay smooth and white like the world had hit pause. Julia was still asleep on the couch, her face softened by exhaustion. I watched her for a long time, realizing how much of Jonathan's quiet defiance lived in her. His jawline, his stubborn way of dreaming even when the math didn't add up. I made coffee, careful not to wake her, then opened my laptop again. The email from mcreederthprotonmail.com still glowed on the screen like a taunt. Locker 17 isn't in a bank, it's under the ridge. I didn't know what I expected to find there: proof, forgiveness, or one more secret sharp enough to bleed me, but I knew I had to go. When Julia stirred, I said softly, "Put on your boots." She blinked. "Where are we going?" "To finish what your father started." The sun hung low when we reached West Ridge. The air was brittle, the kind that cracks when you breathe. We carried a lantern, shovels, and the brass key Jonathan had left me. The metal hatch in the photo turned out to be real, half buried under snow and soil behind a cluster of dead aspens. Together we dug until the hinges appeared black and rusted. Julia looked at me. "Are you sure?" I nodded. "You deserve to know everything." The hatch resisted the first few pulls, then gave way with a groan that echoed down into darkness. A short ladder led to a concrete corridor, barely tall enough to stand upright. The air smelled of cold iron and something older, machine oil and memory. We descended slowly, our lantern throwing wild shadows on the walls. About 10 feet in, we reached a small metal door. The number 17 was stenciled in red, faded but visible. My hands trembled as I fitted the second brass key into the lock. It turned easily. Inside was a single room no larger than a pantry. A folding table stood in the center, and on it a laptop sealed in a plastic bag, a notebook, and a hard drive labeled "Confession." Julia whispered Dad's handwriting. We sat on the floor beside the table, the lantern flickering. I plugged the drive into the laptop. The screen came alive and Jonathan's face filled it. He looked thinner than ever, older, the skin around his eyes drawn tight, but the voice was steady. "If you're watching this, Catherine, then I failed to keep the peace. I never wanted you to know this version of me. The Hales weren't just drilling for oil, they were covering something up. In 1998, the well we lost wasn't a natural collapse. It was sabotage. Someone tried to expose Robert's deals with Northern Extraction. Meredith was the one who warned me. She thought she could save us both." He took a deep breath. The camera wobbled slightly. Then I heard it, the faint sound of another breath just behind the microphone, someone else in that room with him. I tried to record proof, Jonathan continued. But the night the well exploded, Meredith was down there. She didn't make it out. Robert said it was an accident, but I saw the detonator. Alan planted it. They killed her to hide what they'd been doing. I've carried that lie ever since. My chest tightened. Jonathan looked off screen, and for a second his voice softened. "I wanted to tell you, Kat. Every time you asked about the farm, I almost did. But I thought protecting you meant keeping you in the dark. That was my sin. If you want to end this, the files in Locker 17 hold everything, the real survey data, the transfers, even the names of the men they bribed. Give them to Edward. He'll know what to do." Then came a sound that didn't belong to memory, a chair scraping, a man's voice, low but clear. "We need to go. They're already here." Jonathan turned toward the camera one last time. "If they find me first, promise me one thing: don't let this become another of those family revenge stories. Don't let it consume you." The screen froze, then went black. Julia covered her mouth. "Oh my God, Mom." I closed the laptop, the silence around us suddenly enormous. The words "family revenge stories" echoed in my head like a curse. I'd thought this was about inheritance, about land and grief. But this was blood over blood. A legacy of guilt wearing the mask of family loyalty. When we climbed back to the surface, the light had shifted softer, almost golden. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air. For a moment the world looked pure again, untouched by secrets. But I knew better now. Purity is just what truth wears before it gets dirty. Back at the house, Julia sat at the table turning the hard drive in her hands. He didn't just love Meredith, she said quietly. He owed her. I nodded. And maybe now we owe him the same thing, justice. She looked up, tears balanced in her eyes. What if it's too dangerous? What if Robert's men come back? They already did, I said. They just didn't find what they were looking for. That night, as Julia slept upstairs, I wrote everything down: the confession, the coordinates, the dates. I wanted something solid to hold on to when memory began to betray me. Around midnight, a knock rattled the door. My heart jumped. But when I looked through the window, I saw Ellis. He stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. "You've been busy," he said, nodding toward the mud on my coat. I found locker 17. His face paled slightly. "Then you know." I studied him. "You knew too." He hesitated. "Not all of it. Jonathan told me to watch the ridge after the explosion. Said if anyone came asking questions, I should send them away. But he never said why. When the company men came last week, I thought maybe—" "Company men?" He nodded. "Said they were with Northern Extraction. Wanted access to the shed. I didn't let them near it." Something in his voice wavered. I realized he'd been protecting me in his own quiet way. "Thank you," I said, "but we're past hiding now." He frowned. "You planning to go public?" "I'm planning to do what Jonathan couldn't," he sighed, rubbing his temples. "Then you'd better do it fast. The Hales are calling a family meeting. Tomorrow. In Helena. They want you there." Of course they did. Wolves invite the lamb only when they've already decided what to do with her. The next morning I dressed carefully, the gray wool coat Jonathan loved, leather gloves, boots, clean enough to look civilized, but strong enough to run in if I had to. Julia wanted to come, but I told her to stay. If I'm not back by sundown, I said, drive to Edward's office. Give him the drive. Her eyes widened. "Mom, promise me." She nodded reluctantly, the same fear I'd once hidden from her now mirrored back at me. Helena was 3 hours away, long enough for doubt to take shape in the passenger seat. I thought about Jonathan's last line, his plea not to let this become another of those family revenge stories. Maybe it was too late. Every generation inherits the war their parents leave unfinished. Robert's office was high glass and dark wood, a monument to ego. Alan sat near the window, phone in hand, while David poured coffee like a man auditioning for politeness. Robert greeted me with that politician's smile he'd perfected years ago. "Catherine," he said warmly, "we were hoping to talk sense before things get messy." I placed my gloves on the table. Messy's already a family tradition. Alan leaned forward. "We know what you found. Those files belong to the company." "They belong to the truth," I said. Robert sighed. "Always the righteous one. Jonathan loved that about you." Something in his voice made my skin crawl. He loved honesty. "You should try it." He laughed softly. "You think exposing us will bring him back? You'll destroy your own daughter in the process." "What do you mean?" Alan slid a paper across the table, a bank statement with Julia's name. "She accepted a transfer last month. From one of our accounts. Looks like she's already on the payroll." My stomach dropped. "You're lying." Robert smiled again. "Maybe, maybe not. Depends on how you play this." I walked out before the room could swallow me whole. Outside, the wind cut like a blade. I didn't know what hurt more, their threats or the seed of doubt they'd planted. Could Julia have reached out to them without telling me? On the drive home, snow began to fall again, thick and blinding. I pulled over at a turnout and sat there, engine humming, the world fading behind white. I thought about Jonathan's voice, his plea, his mistakes. I thought about Meredith's ghost and my daughter's fear. Then quietly, I whispered into the storm, "This ends with me." I don't know if I meant the lies or the revenge. Maybe both. If you've ever believed in second chances, in the fragile possibility that truth can still cleanse what's broken, stay with me. This story isn't done yet. And if you want the next part to find its way to you, leave, like it tells me you're still here listening. When I left Helena, the world was already dissolving into snow. The sky hung low, the color of unwashed steel. Every mile between the city and Silver Ridge felt heavier than the last, like the road itself was trying to warn me to turn back. But I didn't. The only thing worse than fear is the thought of surrendering to it. By the time I reached the farm, dusk had turned everything the same bruised shade of blue. The first thing I noticed was the tire tracks, wide, deep, fresh, cutting through the snow near the barn. The second was the black SUV parked under the old elm, its engine ticking faintly in the cold. No lights, no movement, just waiting. I killed my headlights before pulling in and sat there for a moment, heart knocking against my ribs. Every instinct said leave, but the thought of Julia alone inside the house, trusting me to come back, rooted me in place. I stepped out, snow crunching underfoot, and made my way toward the porch. The front door stood ajar. "Julia." My voice came out smaller than I meant it to. "It's me." No answer. The house smelled faintly of smoke and damp wool. I found her in the living room, curled under a blanket, asleep. Relief swept through me, so sharp it almost hurt. I locked the door, drew the curtains, and turned off the porch light. That's when I saw the red dot through the window, a small pinpoint of light moving slowly across the wall. A laser sight. I dropped to the floor and pulled Julia down with me. "Stay low," I whispered. She blinked awake, dazed. "What's happening?" I didn't answer. Outside, an engine roared to life. Tires spun, gravel spat. Then the sound faded into the distance. Only then did I realize I was shaking. The rest of the night we stayed on the floor, barely breathing. Julia clutched my hand the way she used to as a child during thunderstorms. Somewhere in the darkness, a memory rose, Jonathan teaching her how to face her fears by naming them out loud. "Fear shrinks when you call it by name," he'd said. But I didn't know what name to give this one. At dawn, Ellis arrived. He'd heard the gunfire on the police scanner. "They didn't hit anything," he said, kneeling to examine the bullet hole near the window frame. "Just a warning shot." A warning for what Julia asked. He looked at me for digging too deep. We sat at the kitchen table while the wind scraped against the eaves. The fear in the room was a living thing. But beneath it, I felt something else, something I hadn't felt since Jonathan's death. Anger. Clean-focused, electric. "They think they can scare me into silence," I said. "They've forgotten who taught me to stand my ground." Ellis raised an eyebrow. "Jonathan." "No," I said. "Life." Julia reached for my arm. "Mom, please, you can't fight them alone." "I'm not alone." I looked at the radio on the shelf, the one Jonathan had used years ago to communicate with survey teams in the valley. It hadn't been turned on in decades, but the thought of his voice once traveling through that static filled me with a strange comfort. I connected the radio to power and tuned through the frequencies until I heard the familiar hiss of open air. "Edward," I said into the mic, "if you can hear this, it's Catherine. They came last night. It's time." The response came minutes later, faint but clear. "Catherine, you're live on Channel 4 relay." "Say that again." I said, "It's time. Send the files." Julia looked at me alarmed. "What are you doing?" "Broadcasting," I said. "If they want to play war, I'll give them one they can't control." Edward patched me through to a local journalist named Carla Donnelly, who ran an independent radio segment out of Helena. I told her everything: Jonathan's confession, the explosion, the buried evidence. My voice shook at first, then steadied. Truth has its own kind of armor once you start wearing it. When I finished, Carla said quietly, "Mrs. Hale, you just named some of the most powerful men in the state. Are you ready for what comes next?" "I've been ready since the day my husband died," I said. We ended the call, but the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. Julia paced the kitchen, chewing her thumbnail. "You just told the world everything," she said. "What if they come back?" "They will," I said. "That's how bullies work. But the difference is, this time they'll have to do it in daylight." That afternoon, Ellis repaired the shattered window and helped me rig a floodlight near the barn. The snow glittered in the beam like crushed glass. The fear was still there, but it had changed texture, less a weight, more a weapon. Later, while Julia slept, I went to Jonathan's study. The scent of cedar and ink still lingered, faint but stubborn. I sat at his desk, staring at the worn edge of the leather blotter where his pen used to rest. I could almost hear him breathing behind me. For the first time, I spoke to him aloud. "You were right, Jonathan," I said. "It's not about revenge. It's about refusing to disappear." Outside, the wind rose again. Somewhere a branch cracked. I went to the window and saw headlights at the far end of the drive, 2 cars this time. I grabbed the shotgun Jonathan kept behind the door and chambered a shell. The sound was louder than I remembered. The cars stopped halfway up the hill. Doors opened, voices drifted on the wind. Ellis came running from the barn, his breath steaming. "They're here," he said. We took cover behind the porch railing. I could see the shapes of men moving toward the house, their flashlights cutting through the snow. One called out, "Mrs. Hale." "We just want to talk." I almost laughed. That's what they always say before they stop listening. Ellis fired a warning shot into the air. The men ducked behind the SUV, shouting. Then one of them threw something. It hit the snow near the porch and hissed. Smoke spread fast, thick and acrid gas. My eyes burned. Ellis shouted, "Get back inside." He pushed me through the door and slammed it shut. The house filled with haze. Julia coughed, eyes watering. Somewhere upstairs a window shattered. "Basement," I said, dragging her toward the stairs. "Go." We stumbled into the cellar. The old radio still hummed faintly. I grabbed the mic. "Edward," I gasped. "They're here. Send the police." But the static drowned me out. Then faintly through the haze, I heard Ellis's voice shouting above the noise, followed by another gunshot. Julia covered her ears. "Mom, I'm scared." "I know, baby, but listen, fear doesn't get the last word. We do." The next sound was sirens, distant at first, then closer. Someone must have heard the gunfire. The intruders fled before the cruisers reached the ridge. When the deputies finally pulled us out, coughing and shaking, the air outside smelled of burnt metal and victory. They took statements, photographed the damage, promised protection. But I knew better than to trust promises that come after the danger has passed. When the officers left, the farm looked almost peaceful again, the snow soft, the horizon washed clean. Julia leaned against me, her face pale but fierce. "They'll try again," she said. Maybe I answered, but so will we. I looked toward the ridge where Locker 17 had slept for decades. The truth buried there had already begun to shift the ground beneath us. This wasn't about land anymore. It was about inheritance, the moral kind. The kind you earn by refusing to be silent. Later, sitting by the fire, Julia asked quietly, "Do you think Dad would be proud?" I smiled through the ache. He'd probably tell us to move to Florida. She laughed, a real laugh, small but alive. "Then why stay?" "Because this is where the story ends right or doesn't end at all. I don't know if courage is something you're born with or something grief grows in you like moss on old stone. All I know is that night when I closed my eyes, I wasn't the same woman who'd opened the door to a laser sight 12 hours earlier. I was something harder, sharper, forged by everything the world had tried to take. If you followed me this far, you already know this isn't just one of those family revenge stories. It's something quieter and far more dangerous, a story about what happens when love refuses to die, even after truth has broken its bones. And before we move on, do me a favor, if you believe standing up still matters, give this story a like. It tells me you're still out there refusing to look away. Morning arrived, gray and hollow, the kind of light that makes everything look like a memory. The smoke from last night still clung to the edges of the porch. I could smell it in my hair and the curtains, in the very bones of the house. The deputies had left before dawn, leaving behind yellow tape and the faint echo of promises no one intended to keep. Julia slept upstairs, exhaustion pulling her under. Ellis sat at the kitchen table, nursing black coffee, his eyes red from a night without rest. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was heavy, like the air before a storm. Finally, he said, "They'll come back." I nodded, "I know." He studied me over the rim of his mug. "Then what's next?" I looked out the window toward the ridge. The world outside was calm, deceptively so. "Next," I said slowly, "we stop waiting for them to strike. We find whatever it is they're afraid of us finding." He frowned. "You think there's more?" "I don't think," I said. "I know." After breakfast, while Ellis checked the barn and Julia slept, I went into Jonathan's study. The room felt different now, not haunted exactly, but charged, as though the air itself remembered too much. I opened the curtains and let the pale winter light spill across the floor. Dust floated like ash. The desk stood exactly as I'd left it. Tidy, restrained Jonathan's handwriting, still sharp on old receipts and notes. But something was wrong. The rug beneath the desk had shifted slightly, one corner turned up. When I knelt to straighten it, my hand brushed against a ridge in the floorboard. A faint seam. I froze. There was no reason for a seam there. Jonathan had been a meticulous man. He would never have left something like that unfinished. I ran my fingers along the edge, felt the subtle give of wood that had been lifted and replaced many times. A hiding place. I fetched a screwdriver from the drawer and pried the board loose. Beneath it was a small tin box, rusted at the hinges, the kind that belonged to another century. My pulse quickened. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, was a bundle of papers tied with twine. At the top, a single envelope. The handwriting was unfamiliar, bold, slanted, impatient. The words on the front stopped my breath. "To the one who finally listens." I sat back on my heels. For a long moment, I couldn't bring myself to open it. The house was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the faint creak of settling beams. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft as a secret. Then I broke the seal. The paper inside was brittle with age, the ink faded but legible. If you are reading this, then the truth has outlived me. My name is Richard Hale. You know me, though you may not realize it yet. I was not the man my sons believed me to be, nor the father Jonathan deserved. What you've inherited is not just land, it's the weight of everything I buried beneath it. Richard Hale, Jonathan's father, the man who died decades ago or so, I'd been told. I kept reading, my eyes devouring the words. When I struck oil on this land, I thought I'd found salvation. Instead, I found rot. I hid it from my sons, from their mother, from everyone. I sold rights I didn't own, forged signatures, buried debts in false ledgers. By the time they discovered it, it was too late. The land was cursed not by superstition, but by greed. The bloodline that followed has carried that stain ever since. My throat tightened. The Mitchell brothers' obsession, the endless fighting, Jonathan's torment, it all traced back to this man, this confession. I chose one son to save the one who saw what I'd become and walked away. Jonathan. The others stayed feeding on the same poison I left behind. If you find this letter, know that truth was my final act of repentance. The oil beneath these hills is worth a fortune, but its cost was my soul. At the bottom of the page, another line in darker ink written with shaking hands. Tell her I'm sorry. No name, no explanation. I sat there, the letter trembling in my hands. Tell who, I whispered. Behind me, the floor creaked. I turned to find Ellis in the doorway, eyes widening at the sight of the open box. You found something, he said. Jonathan's father, I murmured. He confessed everything. The oil, the fraud, the lies. All of it started with him. Ellis crossed the room, reading over my shoulder. That explains the missing records from the county archive. He must have destroyed them before anyone could prove ownership. There's more, I said, reaching for the bundle beneath the letter. Inside were maps, survey reports, and old deeds, but one paper caught my eye. It was newer, written in Jonathan's hand. Ellis, if she finds this before I can explain, help her finish what I couldn't. The redemption isn't in keeping the land, it's in cleansing it. Ellis's jaw tightened. He told me once the past wasn't buried as deep as people think. I didn't know what he meant. I folded the papers carefully. Now we do. We spent the rest of the morning sorting through the documents. Each page peeled back another layer of deceit, names of shell companies, fraudulent transfers, government bribes dating back 40 years. It was enough to bring down half the energy board if made public. Julia came downstairs just before noon, her hair tangled, her voice hoarse. Mom, what are you doing? Finishing what your father started. She stared at the piles of paper. You mean ruining what's left of our family name? No, I said quietly, saving it. Her eyes flashed. From who they'll never stop. You said so yourself. They don't have to, I said, holding up the letter. Because now the truth speaks louder than they do. Julia didn't answer. She looked at me for a long moment, really looked, and something in her expression softened. Then we do it together. That evening, as snow piled against the windows, we set up the old projector Jonathan had used to review blueprints. Page by page, we photographed and digitized every document. Ellis handled the technical work. Julia cataloged each file. I read the letters aloud, my voice steady even as my heart cracked open. When I reached the end, silence filled the room. Then Julia said softly, He knew. Dad knew this would all come out. Yes, I said. He just wanted to make sure we'd be strong enough to face it. Later, when Ellis went to check the generator, I sat alone in the study staring at the last line of Richard Hale's letter. Tell her I'm sorry. Who was she? Jonathan's mother? Someone else? The thought haunted me. I pulled open the bottom drawer of the desk, the one that had always stuck slightly. Inside was a single photograph I'd never seen before, a young woman standing in front of the original farmhouse, her smile shy but unmistakable. On the back, in Jonathan's handwriting, her name was Eleanor, the woman he never spoke of, the one who left. It hit me like a tide, the missing piece. Eleanor wasn't a stranger. She was the grandmother Julia never met, the woman who'd run to protect her son from the legacy that still hunted us. I turned the photograph over again, and for the first time, I noticed the landscape behind her, the ridge untouched, beautiful, the way it had looked before the drills, a future unspoiled. At that moment, I understood what Jonathan had meant by cleansing the land. It wasn't just about truth. It was about restoration, about reclaiming what greed had poisoned. The next morning, I called Carla Donnelly, the journalist who'd aired my broadcast. I told her I had something she needed to see, bring everything I said. This isn't just a story about corruption anymore. It's a story about redemption. When she arrived that afternoon, bundled in a wool coat, I handed her the tin box and the letter. Her hands shook slightly as she read. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. "Mrs. Hale," she said softly, "this could change everything." "Then let it," I replied. As she left, I stood at the window watching her car wind down the snowy drive. For the first time since Jonathan's death, the air felt lighter, as though the house itself had exhaled. I went outside, boots crunching through the snow, and looked up at the ridge. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and old ghosts mingling in the cold. Somewhere beneath that frozen ground lay the curse Richard Hale had written about, but also the promise Jonathan had rebuilt that truth once unearthed could finally set us free. The storm clouds broke just before sunset, and a single shaft of light spilled across the fields, illuminating the porch where we'd fought for our lives only a night ago. I smiled, not out of joy but understanding. Some stories aren't meant to end in peace, they end in clarity. And as I turned back toward the farmhouse, I whispered to the wind, "I'm listening." When the invitation arrived, I almost laughed. It came in a cream envelope with the Hale crest embossed in gold, the same emblem that had once hung above the fireplace in Robert's mansion, the same symbol carved into the oil barrels buried beneath the ridge. Inside, a single line written in Robert's elegant performative hand. "Let's put an end to this once and for all. Dinner tomorrow night, 7 p.m. No threats this time, no conditions, just that. I showed it to Julia over breakfast. She looked at me as if I'd handed her a loaded gun. "You're not actually going," she said. "I am," I answered. "Mom, it's a trap. He's going to corner you or worse." "Then let him try." Her voice trembled. "Why would you risk everything now when you've already won the letters in Carla's hands? The truth's out there." "Not all of it," I said. "There's one thing I still don't know." "What?" Why Jonathan stayed silent. Julia stared at me for a long moment before whispering, "Maybe some truths aren't meant to be spoken." I smiled faintly. "Then they'll have to listen anyway." By late afternoon, I'd packed a small recorder in my coat pocket, an old-fashioned device, heavy and simple, the kind Jonathan once used for dictation. It clicked softly when I tested it, a sound that reminded me of loaded chambers. The drive to the mansion took an hour. The road was half buried in snow, the trees skeletal in the fading light. I kept the heater low, my breath fogging the windshield. The radio played softly news about the investigation, hints that the Hales' assets were being audited, that state regulators had taken interest. Carla had done her job. The world was listening. But tonight wasn't about the world. Tonight was personal. When I reached the gates, they opened automatically, as if someone had been watching my headlights approach. The driveway wound up the hill, lined with dead maples and the ghosts of better seasons. The mansion stood at the top, lights glowing from every window, almost theatrical in its welcome. Robert himself greeted me at the door, a glass of bourbon in hand. He looked older than I remembered, thinner too, but the confidence was still there, stitched into his posture like an expensive suit. "Catherine," he said warmly, "you look radiant." "And you," I said, "look like a man who's finally afraid." He smiled. "Let's not spoil the evening with old wounds." Inside, the long dining table glittered with silverware and candles. Alan and David were already seated, both wearing that brittle calm people use when pretending to be civilized. The smell of roasted meat and red wine filled the air, thick and cloying. "Julia not joining us?" Alan asked. "She prefers not to dine with predators," I said. Robert chuckled, gesturing to a chair. "Still sharp. I always admired that about you." I sat down, sliding the recorder into my lap. "You said this was about ending things." "It is," Robert replied, pouring wine into my glass. "You've made quite the spectacle. Carla Donnelly. The radio broadcast the police inquiries. You've turned our family into a circus." "Our family," I repeated softly. Interesting word choice, considering you've spent years trying to erase me from it. He ignored that. "All this noise will die down, Catherine. It always does. Money buys silence faster than truth buys loyalty." I leaned forward, and yet here I am still talking. For a moment, he looked genuinely amused. "You remind me of Richard," he said, always thinking words could save him. That name landed like a strike. "He tried," I said quietly. "But you made sure no one heard him." Robert's gaze sharpened. "So you found his letter?" "Yes," I said, "and I gave it to someone who knows what to do with it." Alan shifted in his chair, his fork clattering against the plate. David swore under his breath. Robert only smiled wider. "Do you really think one letter can undo generations of power?" he asked. "It already has," I said, "because it told the truth." He laughed, then a deep, hollow sound that didn't reach his eyes. "You think you're fighting corruption, but all you've done is dig up ghosts. My father was a thief, yes, but without his lies, none of us would have had anything, including Jonathan." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What do you mean?" He took a sip of bourbon, savoring the pause. "Jonathan wasn't as innocent as you believe. He signed the last deal, Catherine. the deal that kept the company alive. He took the money, built your perfect little world with it. You're not the widow of a saint. You're the wife of a silent partner." My hands trembled, but I kept my voice steady. "You're lying." "Am I?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. Inside were photocopies of documents, contracts, signatures. Jonathan's name stared back at me in clean black ink. My breath caught. The letters matched perfectly. I looked up at Robert, whose eyes gleamed with triumph. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I want you to understand," he said softly. "You're not the hero of this story. You're just the last fool still clinging to it." For a heartbeat, I couldn't move. The world tilted, the candlelight blurred, my pulse drummed in my ears. Then somewhere beneath the roar of humiliation, a calm thought emerged, record everything. I pressed the recorder in my lap, the faint click lost beneath the sound of Robert pouring himself another drink. He went on, almost wistful now. "We gave him a choice, you know. Stay quiet and live well, or speak and die poor. He chose quiet, and for that I respected him." I swallowed hard. "And Meredith Clark, did you respect her too?" The smile vanished. "She made things difficult. She thought she could expose us. Alan took care of that." Alan's head snapped up. "Robert." But it was too late. The words were out. I rose slowly from my chair, the recorder still running. "You killed her," I said. "No," Robert said calmly. "We protected what was ours. You'd do the same." "Never." He leaned back, smirking. "You already did. Every meal you shared with Jonathan was bought with the same blood." The room seemed to shrink around me. The air felt thin. But through the haze of fury and disbelief, a single truth crystallized. I didn't need to win this argument. I just needed to survive it. I gathered my coat. "Enjoy your dinner, Robert. You just told the world everything I needed." He frowned. "What do you mean?" I smiled faintly. "You're not as careful as you think. The moment you said Alan took care of that, the microphones in my coat picked it up. You've been broadcasting for the last 10 minutes. Alan's face went white. "You're bluffing." I turned toward the window where a faint red light blinked in the distance. Carla's team parked down the hill, recording the entire feed. "Am I?" For the first time, Robert looked afraid. He lunged for me, but Ellis appeared in the doorway like a shadow shotgun in hand. "I wouldn't," he said calmly. "Let her go, Robert." The brothers froze. I walked past them without another word, the weight of years lifting with each step. Outside, the night air was crisp, the stars sharp enough to cut. When I reached the bottom of the hill, Carla met me halfway, her eyes wide. "We got it all," she said. "Every word." I nodded. "Then it's over." She hesitated. "Are you sure?" I looked back at the mansion, its windows glowing like watchful eyes. Somewhere inside, Robert Hale was realizing for the first time what real power sounded like, not wealth, not fear, but truth on record. "Yes," I said finally, "it's over." We drove back in silence, headlights carving through the darkness. Julia was waiting on the porch when we arrived. When she saw my face, she didn't ask what happened. She just opened her arms. I held her tight, the recorder still warm in my pocket, the weight of the past finally shifting from my shoulders. Somewhere behind us, the mansion lights flickered, and I thought I saw the faint outline of Jonathan's shadow in the window, watching, maybe even smiling. For the first time in years, I let myself breathe. Tomorrow, the world would know everything. But tonight, the war was done. The morning after the broadcast felt like the first dawn in years. For once, Silver Ridge was silent. No engines on the hill, no shadows under the trees, only the soft wind moving through the snow. The world had heard Robert Hale's confession. By noon, his mansion was surrounded by reporters, and the family name that had ruled this valley for generations finally began to crumble beneath the weight of its own truth. I watched from the porch as the light shifted across the fields. Julia stood beside me, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. She didn't speak, and she didn't have to. Between us hung the quiet understanding that some wars are not won by victory, but by survival. When I closed my eyes, I could still hear Jonathan's voice on the old recordings, calm, patient, filled with that steady faith I used to mistake for stubbornness. He'd always said the land would outlive our sins if we let it breathe again, and maybe he was right. Yesterday, the soil beneath the ridge stopped feeling cursed. It felt alive. In the weeks that followed, investigators came and went. Carla Donnelly's report aired across the country, calling it the fall of the Hale Empire. But she missed one truth. I wish she'd told this story was never about power or property. It was about conscience, about the cost of silence and the courage to speak when silence would be easier. Sometimes I walked to the ridge alone. The air there smells of pine and frost, the earth damp and forgiving. I place my hand against the frozen ground and whisper, "We kept our promise." Maybe that's what peace really is, not the absence of pain, but the presence of meaning. For those listening to me now, especially those who have lived long enough to know that families can love and wound in the same breath, remember this truth is not the opposite of love. It's what makes love real. And forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's choosing to stop letting the past own your tomorrow. Silver Ridge stands again, not as a monument to the Hales, but as a reminder that every generation gets the chance to break its own curse. That's the only inheritance worth leaving. If you've walked through this journey with me, thank you for listening, for feeling, for believing that stories still matter. Before you go, tell me in the comments, do you believe truth can heal a family? Or does it only set us free? Press 0 for heal, 1 for set free. And if this story touched you, please like, subscribe, and share it so that others can hear how even in the darkest legacy, redemption still finds